Welcome to this Gallery Teachers Masterclass. My name is Neil Harris. I'm a teacher trainer and Director of Marketing at CELT Centre for English Language Teaching in Cardiff. And today we're going to be talking about listening. So I've decided to call this presentation Teaching Listening, the Cinderella Skill, which I imagine is something that has already got you thinking. What is that link between listening and Cinderella? Well, this is actually something that David Noonan came up with when he was describing the listening skill as the skill that was overlooked. And I think it's very fair to say that in my teaching career, I've very much been guilty of overlooking listening and privileging other skills, particularly the so-called productive skills of speaking and to a lesser skill writing in my classes. And it was only a couple of years ago when I was doing some additional training to become a provider at the premium level for the occupational English test that I really became aware of the shortcomings in my own teaching of the listening skill. So this presentation is really my journey, and I think also the journey of many people as they come to grips with how to teach listening more effectively. And I hope that during this presentation, I'll be able to give you some ideas so that you avoid some of the traps that I've fallen into over the years. So moving on, let's begin with a question. And I'd like you to consider the following. What kind of teacher do you consider yourself to be when teaching listening? And there are two options here. And here they are coming up on screen. On the left, the listening testing teacher, someone who provides their students with lots and lots of teaching practice of listening. So in their classes, the students are actively involved in listening practice. And then on the right, the listening development teacher, the teacher who goes beyond providing mere practice and helps students by giving them scaffolded skills, which enables the learners to unpick the competencies which enable them to become more successful listeners. And my thesis in this masterclass is that to do the best by our students, we need to move away from the position of being a teacher who is on the left, listening testing, which masquerades as practice, and become much more the kind of teacher who is identified on the right, the kind of teacher who provides listening development. Now, at this point, you may be asking yourselves, okay, but how do I do this? I need help. And this was very much the kind of teacher that I was, and I think to an extent probably still am. But having gone through a process of quite a lot of CPD, talking to colleagues, talking to other teacher trainers, I hope I now have a better understanding, which I can share with you, of what kind of help is available to you and what you need to be doing to achieve that status as the listening development style teacher. So I thought it was worth just thinking about what happens when listening goes wrong. And I'm going to play you a very short clip. This is on YouTube of a singer who is auditioning for Music Idol. And I think you'll realize very quickly that the problem here is that this performer has misheard the lyrics of a famous song. Now, I hope we're more sensitive than the panel in our classrooms when we hear students talking and they've misheard a stretch of language. because of course this lady has at some point misheard the lyric "can't live" as Ken Lee. So this is, I think, symptomatic, particularly of students living in countries where English is the language they hear every day, but also for students who have less exposure to spoken language and therefore have a paucity of exposure. I think they have similar problems, that sometimes they just get the wrong end of the listening stick. But is listening actually that important? Well, I think there are strong arguments to suggest that it is. In 2015, Jack Richards stated that effective listening comprehension skills are the basis of second language learning. I don't think can be much stronger a requirement, therefore, to help our learners to become effective learners of English, that they need to be effective listeners of English. Likewise, back in the 80s, Krashen was talking about the natural approach, and he looked at the importance of comprehensible input to trigger language development. And if we don't enable our learners to make what they hear in some way comprehensible, and I'll talk more about this later when we look at decoding, then I think we are depriving our students of that opportunity to understand what they're hearing and turn it into comprehensible input via decoding. And then finally, in the 80s and 90s, where there was considerable interest in cognitive psychology, looking at bottom-up and top-down processing, I'm sure we're all familiar of top-down processing when teaching listening. We begin by asking the students to activate their schemata. Well, that's great. But I think very often, and only we've overlooked the bottom-up processing, the decoding processing, which is now becoming much more respected as an important way to help our students to be more effective as listeners. So moving on, clearly it's the case that listening is a challenge for teachers as well as for listeners. And I'd like to illustrate for you by showing 4 slides what I consider to be some of the issues facing teachers when they are involved in listening. So here are the 4 slides. And this first one, and I'll reveal in a few moments what these slides depict, but I thought it would be interesting for you to be thinking about what you can see here and how it relates to the challenges of the listening classroom for us teachers. Here's the second picture. That was the third image, showing some course books. And here is the fourth and final image. And these, I think, illustrate, as I was saying, those 4 challenges. So in the first picture of that group of cartoon figures sitting together, clearly it was an illustration of a group of people talking. But I don't think we really give our students in the classroom sufficient practice of the reality of listening, which is groups of people talking simultaneously, often over the top of one another, with no clear turn taking. The second picture, showing 2 of the very many different types of early career teacher training that is available, I think identifies the problem, and I'm as guilty as anyone of this as a teacher trainer, that when we are preparing new teachers to teach receptive skills, we spend a lot of time talking about the staging of the lesson, but I think we spend insufficient time talking about the sub-skills required for good listening classes. That third picture, showing a variety of course books, I think compounds this problem, that they very often demonstrate, or at least in the past, very often demonstrated this focus on a well-staged listening practice lesson, but didn't really go on to look at the sub-skills in any great substance and detail. And then finally, in the real world, just imagine having a conversation with someone at a railway station, something you might quite often hear being tested in a first certificate exam. But in the first certificate exam, the extraneous noise that is around you is filtered down to a very low level. But in the real world, there is lots of noise coming at us. You will have seen in that fourth picture a group of people talking, I think in a classroom, and all around them were other groups huddled together. That creates a lot of background noise. But do we actually sensitize students to being able to deal with this reality in the classroom? And I think the reality is, in the many, many lessons that I've observed, very rarely have I ever seen this. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen this being dealt with. We therefore are in a situation where we have a problem, that listening isn't always taught very well. So therefore, what are the solutions that are available to us in order that we can make our students successful? There is a clear choice available. We can just carry on doing what we've always done, because very often, even in observations, the observer perhaps often doesn't pick up on some of the challenges of how to teach listening subskills, because they may not be fully aware of them themselves. Or we can, and use that famous phrase, feel the fear and do it anyway. And that was my journey. I decided I needed to feel that fear and try and come to grips with how to be a better listening teacher. So the first issue, the nature of spoken discourse. And I think that links to the first picture and the last picture. People together, not respecting turn takers, and lots of extraneous noise. What are some of the challenges? And I'm just going to pause here for a few seconds to give you some time to reflect and just think about what are the distinctive characteristics of spoken discourse. Well, you may well have thought of some of the ideas that are going to come up on screen now. So at the bottom, with blends and reductions, we have examples of what happens in fast speech. We then have that very frequent issue that students talk about, oh, it was a strange accent, I couldn't understand it. And then at the top, some of the other distinctive issues of spoken language. I'm speaking at a graded speed right now, but if I was in a coffee shop with a group of friends, it's much more likely that I'm speaking at this kind of speed. Maybe I'm even exaggerating a little bit right now. But the thing is, as I'm speaking, then someone else will be thinking and maybe interrupting, and I start pausing, and I'm not quite sure what I'm going to say next. So I pause, and then I have a false start. Oh, I just wanted to say that. Oh, I forgot to mention, and so on. But these all get removed in the language classroom, and I can understand why, but I think to some extent we need to bring them back in. So what are our solutions? Well, I think we need to sensitize our learners more to natural speech, and here are some suggestions. If you're working with a transcript, then I think it's absolutely reasonable, rather than playing the MP3 or the CD, to actually read it aloud yourself as the teacher, initially with plenty of pauses. And then you can read the passage a second and a third time, much as we might do by replaying the recording using technology, but this time by reducing the pausing on subsequent readings. And I hope I've demonstrated that a little bit there. So we begin with reading aloud, initially with plenty of pauses, And then we reduce the pausing on subsequent readings. We read it in much more natural speed. Pause the recording at intervals. Replay with fewer pauses later on. So rather like an exploded recording, we might pause between what in the transcript are paragraph breaks, just to allow particularly lower level learners or students facing a very challenging listening an opportunity just to process and to catch up. This is one that I looked at and I thought, oh, how's that going to work? But it's fantastic for sensitizing students to the nature of spoken language and more fluent rapid speech. Give the students a transcript, but if you're able to manipulate that transcript on a computer, delete every second word. The students then have to fill in the missing words. So at a very granular level, they're having to focus on the sound stream. Now, I would, of course, recommend that the students process the recording for gist at least first, because otherwise they're just going to have a stream of language that has no context or no meaning for them at all. But I think once you've processed for overall meaning, this can be very a powerful way of helping them with decoding faster language stretches. Another option is that you, and this works well, I think, best with monologues or with dialogues, where you're able to record yourself. And clearly with a mobile phone, the ability to record has become much better. That you take a recording and then you clean it up. You play them initially the cleaned up version, the one that has, if you like, the typical listening classroom recording. Any issues are taken out, pauses are added, and so on. And the students use that for processing meaning. But then you follow that up with the original messy recording with all of its instances of spoken language, fast delivery, turn taking that is less well respected, and the students compare the two. And that's a really good way of sensitizing students to the differences between language classroom listening and real world listening. And then finally, focus on a short extract. Get the students to transcribe it and then to analyze its distinctive features. Now, you might well be saying, but Neil, this is pronunciation work. And yes, in many ways it is, because there is a very clear link, I think, between features of rapid speech and how it's pronounced, and then how it is received. And if students aren't aware of those features, then it becomes difficult for them to hear them. And if we go back to that sound recording we listened earlier of can't live, where the t sound really disappears, if the students aren't aware that people don't go around saying can't live, but can't live, then at that point they become perhaps more tolerant of the features of spoken language, and that actually can't live is a more natural rendering of can't live. So moving on, and you may be wondering why I'm showing you now a picture of a lovely modern house with glass walls and the garden. The reason for this is, of course, there is a bit of a trend of bringing the outdoors into the inside. And I wanted to use this as a metaphor of the listening classroom, of bringing the messy listening that takes place outside the classroom inside the classroom, and give you some ideas about how to achieve that. Well, I think students need exposure to authentic spoken language early on. But of course, you're not going to play them a recording of you having a chat to your friends in a coffee shop and expect a beginner or elementary. So you need to have a scaffolded exposure. You need to write a series of tasks, questions that help the students to access that listening step by step. Another option is to expose them to a range of listening types. In the language classroom, very often we rely on recordings that are a monologue or a dialogue. But isn't it the case in the real world that if you go to a meeting, you'll hear lots of people speaking all at the same time? So isn't it only fair that we bring these multi-way recordings into the classroom? Live listening is fantastic. I'm not sure if you're using this already, but this is where the teacher um, they can either pre-record it or literally do it live. They've got a story that they want to tell. So they've got some keywords and they tell the story live. One of the great strengths of this is that it often brings in natural language. It brings in the reality of the teacher or whoever it is, if you have a guest speaker coming in. It's just a bit more interesting in that respect. But also it begins to give the students access, much as you're listening to me now, of how we might speak more naturally. Homestay tasks, another fantastic way if your students and you are in one of the countries where English is an L1, where you have that activity where you set the students a task of going to their homestay and interviewing them on a topic, which will then require them to listen to the answers and bring them back in. A safe way of giving exposure to natural language, and very often less graded language, but from people that the students won't be nervous chatting to. And then finally, and I'll talk about this more later on in this presentation, the idea of decoding activities. Okay, so if we move on to our second issue, this one of training and some of the issues around training. What you can see here is a post that I put for a presentation similar to this one, where I was asking CELTA trainers how they deal with listening. And I made the point that I felt that it was often covered badly. And one of my colleagues, and I quote, said, well, I simply don't have the time to look at all aspects of sub skills. I think bottom-up processing is important, that decoding, and that is important, if possible, to give trainees on early stage an awareness of the need to treat listening lessons as an opportunity to help their students to develop the listening skills and not just practice. So I think there is an awareness among teacher trainers that we can be doing things better. And of course, some are doing it brilliantly. And I wouldn't have necessarily put myself in that category. I consider myself to be a good teacher trainer, but I don't think I was really going beyond what you'll see on the next slide. And this will be very familiar for those of you writing lesson plans. And this is a lesson plan for a listening lesson. And notice here the nicely ordered stages that we always talk about as teacher trainers. We're stimulating interest, we're activating schemata, we're giving practice. Well, that's great. But in giving practice for listening for gist, are we actually going into the sub-skills required for successful gist listening? Probably not. And as a follow-on stage, practicing for specific information. So the students answer some questions, who, when, what, okay. But how do they actually listen differently for specific information than listening for gist? Do we let them in on the secrets? And I think all too often we don't. So on screen now are some suggestions here. I think, yes, that focus on top-down processing at the beginning of a lesson, we need to rethink that. We need to go beyond that. Rather than having restricted sub-skills focus, we need to give our students lots of sub-skills development work. Points 2 and 3. Lessons like the one that you can see here have little or no heed to bottom-up processing and decoding. So we need to include that regularly. And we need to really think about attention to skills and strategy training. And let me show you how to achieve this. So, I'm a great believer in CPD, continuous professional development in-house. There is a school that I've worked with, in fact, it's where I did my diploma many years ago, where the teachers choose the topics that they would like to develop. They then don't wait for the DOS or the senior teacher to deliver that topic, but they research it themselves and they then deliver it. And I think this is a really nice way to work with the development of an area that we find difficult. So get together with a group of colleagues and share your ideas. I think if you're being observed, be brave and ask the observer if they can focus on a particular area. Here I'm suggesting it could be listening. Or work with a group of peers and have focused feedback from your peer group, your fellow teachers, on the success of your teaching sub-skills in listening. I think help should be provided in-house. And I think obviously if you're attending this webinar, then already you're showing an interest, and that's great. Other suggestions, in-house study groups, not dissimilar to the first one. And then finally, online support. There are some great teacher development groups on Facebook. I belong to a number. And I think you just post the question, struggling with listening sub-skills, any ideas? You should get a lot of good answers coming back. Other options, you can go online to look for discrete online training. This is one that's offered, I found, online for the developing of listening skills. Moving on now, we need to be thinking about course books. Now, I think course books, some are good and some are less good. And this is my wish list for better listening skills development in course books. And as we've gone through this presentation, you'll notice some themes emerging. This focus on decoding, the link between listening and pronunciation, and systematic skills development. So with that in mind, I took a look at some modern course books just to see what was going on. And it was, as this picture shows, a mixture of the good, the bad, and the ugly. Caveat emptor, may the buyer beware. I think it's worth having a conversation with your director of studies if you feel that the course book isn't doing listening as well as it could be, and maybe some of the ideas that are coming up provides you with some options for looking at other material that does it well. So this is a very new title, Language Hub. This is the intermediate level. And as I looked at the map here, some of the things that I noticed that this particular book does, and I thought this was very good, was that it's working with checking predictions, top down, as we'd expect, listening for the main idea, but also was looking at signposting language, which I think in presentations is a very nice way to help people think about the staging of a listening passage, and also listening for examples. And very often, if we think about how texts are structured, we'll have a main idea followed by an example. And if we sensitize students to that text structure, it'll help them. Here's another book, again, a recent publication. Rachel Roberts appears here, and she's very interested in listening skills. And this particular book, again, in its course map, I picked out working with keywords, consonant vowel linking. So pronunciation is coming in as a listening skill, and the use of linkers in conversation, helping the learner to orient themselves in the text. This course, Roadmap, also in its blurb for teachers, states that it provides invaluable training in listening sub-skills. For example, predicting information, discourse markers, weak forms, there's that link with pronunciation again, identifying examples and sequencing words. So we're seeing that course books are beginning to pay more attention to these sub-skills. It's not necessarily the case, however, that it appears everywhere. Two very popular books, and rightly so, as you can see here on screen. The publisher stated no explicit teaching of listening skills or sub-skills, no explicit teaching of CFR related CFR linked listening skills in the course. So it is the case, I think, we're transitioning. Don't forget supplementary materials. This is from a book called Skillful. This is the multi-level listening and speaking series. And again, it has a whole list of skills, sub-skills here. Teacher resource books are great as well. There's a really nice book, a resource book for teachers listening, and these are full of good ideas. So what about us? Where do we fit into this teaching matrix, to use Richard's term? Well, I think we can, in our own training, go further. And if you are thinking in the future of a master's or a diploma, almost certainly you'll come across some of the ideas on this slide. But I think it's important that everyone is aware of them from early on. So back in 2003, Brown talked about micro skills, which is really to do with processing at a bottom-up level, and also the macro skills, the opposite, top-down processing. Later on in the 90s and into the early 2000s, strategies were very much being the focus of attention. Field is a very big name in listening. But unfortunately, I think these are off the radar for many people. And I think, if nothing else, if I made you aware of some of these, so that you now know the keywords to go and look on the internet and find out more about listening micro, macro skills and the different strategies, then that gives you a heads up of where you can be doing your research. So yes, we need to look beyond the course book. We need to be taking responsibility ourselves. Be familiar with what these sub-skills are. Try and incorporate them into our own teaching. If you're a busy teacher, you may not particularly, where nowadays, if we're working online a lot, it can be quite difficult to find time to change things. So use the materials that you have access to, but layer over the top some additional work, perhaps working at pronunciation level. And, you know, we talked about that every second word deletion activity, where you take the transcript, which will be in the back of the book, you delete every second word, and then you've got a lovely decoding activity to be working on with the students straight from the course book. Find a friend, work with a buddy, a mentor, talk to your senior teacher, your DOS, ask them for ideas, ask them for inspiration. How do they do it? Okay. And as I've mentioned already, you're not alone. Think about Twitter, think about Facebook for teacher groups. And of course, Gallery Teachers itself, right here, right now, is creating this wonderful community of teachers. And this is a really great starting point, I think, not only for my little section here on listening, but all of the other areas that the masterclasses are covering. So my final point about decoding. There isn't time to play it now, but I wanted you to be aware of a fantastic talk on YouTube called Don't Cry For Me, Margentina. Now you might be thinking, what's that all about? Wasn't that a song called Don't Cry For Me, Argentina by Andrew Lloyd Webber in the musical Evita? Yes, it was. But many years ago, I remember this is a group called the Goodies, and they re-recorded the song as Don't Cry For Me, Margentina. Little did I know at the time that this was actually thinking about the fact of how we mishear things and how we need to work more on decoding. And this wonderful presentation by Rachel, who is a teacher trainer and a coursebook author, looks at developing listening skills through decoding. So all you need to do, go onto YouTube and type in this Don't Cry For Me, Auntie Tina. developing listening skills through decoding, and that'll give you many more ideas than I can give in the time I have here. Moving on. Something else I'd like you to listen to is this short 3 or 4 minute recording, which you'll find again on YouTube, called Squirrel. This is a recording of 2 people talking, and when you listen to it, you'll think you'll understand what they're talking about. And then you realize that the majority of what they're saying is complete gibberish. It's not a known language, but it sounds like English. And this is a really good starting point in terms of our students, getting into their heads, understanding the challenges that they face, because when we empathize more with them, we're in a much better place to provide them with the kind of learning that they require. Okay, so to finish, decoding. Decoding basically is about the ability to understand the noise that is coming in here. And let me give you some examples, and this is taken from Richard Caldwell's work. So he would argue that course books and teachers often say things like, "Would you like a cup of tea?" However, he would argue that in the real world, they won't even hear, "Would you like a cup of tea?" But they may get this, and he describes it as a mush. "We like cup of tea." And we can understand why students wouldn't have a clue. Will you lie? What is will you lie, teacher? And so decoding is all about helping our students to hear, "Will you like cup of tea?" and understand that it is an offer for something to drink. And how do we do that? Well, first of all, we need to be raising our own awareness of how important decoding is for listening. We need to provide our students, and therefore we need to, as teachers, to go out there and look for materials that have a clear decoding focus. We supplement existing materials by looking at the features of fast, rapid speech in the listening activities that we do normally, and we layer them over the top of the listening. Or we change the order. We work on a particular feature of rapid speech first, and then we do a listening, and then we analyze the transcript for finding examples of that feature that we looked at. But we need to be rigorous in our teaching of pronunciation and natural models, not the cleansed, "Would you like a cup of tea?" but "We like cup of tea," and align it with the listening skill to help students not only to be natural speakers, but to be fast, confident, natural processors of the language that they hear around them. So to conclude, listening is hard, and it's hard to teach. That's why I think, to go back to the beginning of the presentation, it's that Cinderella skill. We as teachers often find it difficult to appreciate the challenges our students face, hence that YouTube Squirrel video that I included for you. Probably our training as early career teachers is insufficient, and gallery teachers, in offering the opportunity to look at this issue of listening, I think has been very brave and very prescient in providing you with something that I think is missing on a lot of courses. We need, as teachers, not to be just consumers of course books, but I think we also need to think carefully about how we can adapt them for a better result. And not only course books, but looking for further supplementation, adapting course books, as I've mentioned, bringing in those authentic materials back to the slide where you saw the garden coming into the house, the outside coming in. Then finally, engage with more CPD individually, with groups online, but also with your fellow teachers in the schools where you work, if you're in that context, to support one another. I hope, therefore, that the ideas that I've looked at today will have raised your awareness of the need for much more phonological work, the link between pronunciation, listening via decoding, but also made you realize that how lucky we are with online, that we can work collegiately to address these issues. Absolutely not. I think we have done a lot of damage in making listening and reading classed as the receptive skills. Listening is surely interactive. When we listen, most of the time it's because we are communicating. In a lecture theatre, you may think, oh, I'm only receiving information. But no, you'll be listening to information to then reuse it, perhaps in a presentation or in an academic essay, or you may have a seminar about it afterwards. Much more frequent is when we are listening to groups of people and we are exchanging ideas, opinions, and information. And if we don't understand what we hear, we can't participate fully in that communicative act. So, in my view, listening has never been and never will be passive. It's very much interactional. These are some of the references that you might find useful. Thank you very much indeed, everyone, for listening. I very much look forward to the discussion of this in the future. Thank you all. It's been a pleasure working with you today. Stay well, stay safe.